Okay, it's 12 o'clock. I know people are still coming into the event, but we shall make a start. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's event called Investment Zones, Will They Work?, which was a good title for a program, for an event a couple of weeks ago, maybe not today. I suppose we could rename it Investment Zones, Will They Survive? And if they do survive, how will they change? Not quite as snappy, but probably more accurate. It's the perils of doing or trying to do policy development in a slightly chaotic and ever-changing world. I think we can probably have a reasonable guess that they will change, probably will survive, and probably will change. So we'll get into that in a minute. But I think it is worth us still reflecting on the degree to which these types of interventions work, and in what way, given the challenges that we know places up and down the country are grappling with. Because whether it's investment zones or something else, these kinds of policies have a tendency to come and go with a reasonable amount of frequency. And we've had similar things in the past, whether it's in enterprise zones or free ports and all the rest of it. So I think there's some validity in trying to think through some of these kinds of things. So we've got a good panel to explore this issue. I'll introduce them in a moment. But before we go any further, we want to get your thoughts on questions on new innovation for you that come to Centre for Cities events previously. We haven't done this, so this is the first time. We've got a question that we want you to answer, which in a moment will magically appear on the screen, and you'll have about 30 seconds to click yes or no, and then we'll put up the results, and then we'll get our panelists introduced to reflect on that. So without further ado, can we have the question, please? There is the question, should be on your screens. The question is, investment zones, will they work? Pretty simple. You have a yes or no. We don't offer a maybe, could be, or don't know. We assume that you all have views and opinions on this. So if you just click yes or no on the button, and when the 30 seconds runs out, we will get the results. So just bear with us for 20 seconds or so now. Okay. That would suggest that the answers, here we go. A somewhat skeptical, maybe correctly, audience says investment zones, will they work? 3-1 says no, they won't. Don't forget, you can give your reasons for why you have your view in the questions and answers by putting your questions in the question and answer function, and I'll ask the panelists your questions as we get into the session. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel. Our first panelist is Paul Swinney, my colleague, who's the Director of Policy and Research at the Centre for Cities. Our second panelist is Zoe Billingham. Zoe is the Director of IPPR North. And our third panelist is Peter Foster. And Peter is the Public Policy Editor at the Financial Times and has been writing several things on investment zones over the last few days, as well as the weeks before that. So each of them will say a few words about where we are and what we think, and then we'll get into questions. So Paul, let me come to you first. Just talk to us about, if we assume that they did survive, would investment zones work? Our audience think not. Are they right to think not?
Well, certainly, I think for every one person that's going to disagree with me, 3 people are going to agree with what I'm about to say. So that's pretty reassuring, isn't it? The answer, I think, from our perspective, is that we don't think that they would, and we're being pretty vocal about that. So let me sort of say what my reasons are, and it'd be great to hear or see what other people's reasons are in the chat function as well. So Liz Truss described these as being full fact reports, which actually, when you then look at the detail of, probably isn't a very good reflection of what they actually are proposed to be. We would say they're actually much more full fat enterprise zones, which you had in the 80s and 90s, and then were brought back in the 2010s, rather than necessarily being that following that free port model. Now, that means that looking at the success of enterprise zones or otherwise is quite instructive about what we might expect to see from investment zones if they do come to pass in the format of being proposed. And there are three things that we found when we did some analysis, looking at the ones that were set up in 2011 and sort of fast forwarded 5 years after their origination to understand what impact they had had. The first was that they didn't create many jobs, or certainly many fewer jobs than what the Treasury had predicted. The Treasury was saying that so they were going to create something like 54,000 jobs, and it was less than 20,000 jobs. In reality, that was the case. And if you start digging a little bit more detail, you actually can knock that total down even more. So they were pretty underwhelming in terms of job creation. The jobs that they did create tend to be fairly low skilled, with the exception probably being some of the enterprise zones that were city centre based, like in Birmingham and in Bristol and Liverpool, where there was a degree of higher skilled jobs that were created, but in general, low skilled jobs. And that very much reflects the experience of the 80s and the 90s as well, and those ones that were created. And then the third one was that of the jobs that were created in these zones, actually quite a lot of them were displaced from elsewhere. So our estimates were that at least 1/3 of jobs weren't new jobs, so to speak, but actually just moved from elsewhere. It hopped the boundary to take advantage of the benefits that were being offered within the zone, which is clearly not what we're trying to create when we are creating these very area-specific zones that we create. Now, the question then is, well, why is this? And why is it that these zones aren't doing what they need to do? And the challenge is that they're not really addressing the barriers that a lot of places face in terms of attracting in higher skilled jobs. Those barriers are skills investment, they are market failures around development of property in particular. And what we're seeing from an investment zones proposal in particular is that's focusing on regulation. Now, the reason why Middlesbrough is not growing, for example, is not because there's too much regulation, because there's too much planning, although if we had planning reform, I think it would be helpful. But actually, there are these bigger issues around skills, around commercial space, around transport, which are much bigger barriers as to why these private sector, high-skilled private sector businesses are not going to invest in those areas. And what we need is policy that actually tries to tackle those issues head on. And I think any sort of policy that comes up in a levelling up space has to be able to answer the question of, does it deal with those challenges? Does it actually focus on those things that are stopping those high productivity businesses going to those places? And sadly, I think free ports before that, enterprise zones before that, and then investment zones that come to pass will not do that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. We've already had one comment rather than a question from Richard Holmes. We had an enterprise zone in Sheffield, absolutely no impact whatsoever, and was withdrawn after 5 years. So that suggests investment zones will suffer the same fate. I'm sure he voted no. Zoe, let's hear from you first off as to, if they were still to go forward, accepting that they may not, what kind of effects would we expect? Would you be hopeful about them or not?
Yeah, I hate to go with the majority, Andrew, but I'm with the viewers on this question. And I've kind of asked myself, if investment zones are the answer, what's the question? And actually, when you look at it that way around, I'm really not sure what that question is. And as Paul highlights, if we're looking for levelling up to mean high quality jobs, high productivity work to be moving to our great cities, and maybe towns too, but I'll put that to the side for now, then deregulation and the reforms planned through investment zones and enterprise zones before them just aren't the right answer. I think the only thing I'll add to what Paul has said already about how they're kind of economically inefficient ways of trying to get businesses to reshore or come to the UK for the first time is that there's been an estimate that it actually costs, the last round of enterprise zones cost the government a subsidy of £26,000 per job. So if we're talking low skilled jobs that the government is subsidising, £26,000 per head, you've kind of got to ask yourself, something's going seriously wrong there. I think the other point I'd like to make just in these opening remarks is that the UK is never going to be the cheapest place to do business. So I also think it's a very odd pitch when it comes to trying to get businesses to grow, start, come back to the UK. Quite rightly, we've got some may say crumbling, and I would say that, but we do have, a system of support for people which should keep people healthy, allow them to get a good education, to skill, to reskill. And those are the reasons that businesses want to do business in the UK, not because we're the cheapest, and we will never be the cheapest. So I just think in terms of also the overarching sort of pitch a narrative for why set up a business in the UK, it's completely the wrong approach. So I think both on the economics front and on the sort of optics and reasons to come to the UK, it fails on both fronts as far as I'm concerned. And I know that in the investment zones prospectus, there was sort of some slightly muddled text around how they interact with free ports. But I think actually, whilst there are, of course, some distinctions between the two, it's that same overarching idea that if you cut tax and deregulation in places across the UK, then investment and business will flow in. And I just don't think that's the right analysis or solution of the problem. Yeah. So I'm really glad that the government is pivoting away. I think bits of planning, but maybe we can get into this in the discussion, might be helpful in terms of how we think about targeting development in the places we want across the UK. I think you need to be specific about what you mean by that, because I might disagree with the government's approach on planning too, but maybe we can get into that in the discussion. So heavily skeptical, glad the change of approach, and certainly as the sole plank to the levelling up policy, of which it's been for the last few months, it's totally insufficient.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Zoe. I mean, in some respects, both your and Paul's comments and the reflections from the audience, it do seem to beg the obvious question as to why they were proposed in the way that they were proposed in the first place, which would be interesting reflection from you on why you think that was, notwithstanding kind of, a long-held, maybe mistaken belief in certain ideologies that don't seem to work at the local level. Anyway, Peter, do you want to round us off in terms of just, your reflections on them as they were or as they currently are, and then we'll get into where we think we're going to go, which is probably the more interesting and pertinent question. Peter.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I mean, they're obviously a nonsense, and but I use that as phrase sort of almost advisedly, because they come from a kind of bit of the Tory party, the Britannia Untrained bit. I mean, remember that the OBR, when it did its last proper forecast back in October, said that neither free ports nor investment zones, in its view, would make any difference to GDP growth. And yet Liz Truss comes along and her big wheeze is more investment zones. So at that point, they are a representative of a much more deep-seated kind of fallacy-based policy-making problem, which speaks to what Paul is talking about in terms of, these kind of tax breaks don't attract investment. When they do, they move investment. That's why the Treasury was so against them and reckoned that if they had 40 plus of these things, it would cost £12 billion, because you'd end up, the national insurance tax break, that employees' holiday was, if 6 million people change their job in the country every year, and you've got 40 or even 200 at one point, I think Liz wanted, of these zones, you're essentially just subsidising activity that would have already happened. But actually, the kind of craziness of the concept speaks to a much deeper problem, much broader problem, which is not just that these zones are, not something that's going to attract investment. The reason investment is in such a problem in this country is that when I talk to CEOs of big companies with global parents, they use this dreadful word uninvestable. It's a much bigger regulatory uncertainty piece. So you talk about this new EU retained law bill, which I think is quietly being kicked into touch. But if you're looking at the UK now and you're making 10, 15-year investment horizon decisions, the idea that an investment zone is really going to make that long-term, medium-term investment is for the birds, it seems to me. And so it's good that they're being canned. And I think, whether or not there's a kind of face-saving vestige of them to kind of keep the right of the Tory party happy, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But fundamentally, they're being canned. And I think the bit that's really being canned is that these were zones with ill-defined planning and environmental reductions in environmental and planning burdens, which were never properly defined, and then a load of tax breaks and nothing on the really tricky bit, of course, which is the planning side, which is what we're going to talk about. And I think when they came out, people I know, who understand these things, were immediately just going, ultimately, Liz Truss ducked the planning piece. And it was discussed, but Liz Truss ducked the planning piece at the conception stage because they were terrified of another mutant algorithm type rebellion. And so, ultimately, a flawed concept became even more flawed. And so, not surprisingly, the vast majority of people, on this call who understand these things, I'm sure far better than I do, don't think they're going to work, and they're right. The interesting question, I guess, next is, what will they look like? We do have some fixed points of fact. We know Liz Truss has gone. We know the Treasury is trying to fill a £52 billion black hole. We know the Treasury doesn't like these zones, if you read your Super Soaraway FT. And we know that Michael Gove is back. And I think, those are kind of 4 fairly fixed points of information around which you can now base a discussion of what some kind of interventionary pro-growth policy might look like in a world where the Treasury wants to spend as little money as possible.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll come back. Maybe you should start us on that, Peter, because I know you've been writing and talking to officials and people up and down the country about, where we think we currently are, what the state of play is. So it'd be useful to get your reflections on that. I would also say 75% of you thought they didn't work, but 25% of you did think they would work. So if you want to put in the Q&A function kind of why you thought they might work, if you're one of the 25%, that would be really interesting to get some reflections on that. And obviously Roger Lawrence has put in a post that I agree investment zones won't work, but if not IZs, what? After 40 years of regeneration initiatives, there's no consensus around what's worked, and there's very little policy learning. So we're always quite good in our field, I think, going, well, that won't work, will it? But maybe less confident. But well, this might work or could work, or we're pretty clear that this has worked. Maybe we can get onto that and broader reflections as well. But Peter, give us you've been chatting, you've been writing, you had something out yesterday, but something coming out the next day or so again. Where are we? Where do you think we are in terms of the pivot away from investment zones, maybe back to regen zones that Gove was talking about in the Levelling Up white paper? Where are we? What's the state of play?
So I think that's exactly right, Andrew. The missing planning piece. Gove World was very critical of the zones because they had the missing planning piece, and therefore I think, and the Treasury also sees fixing planning as a way of a cheap way of addressing productivity and supply side issues. And so I think the conversation is around ditching investment zones as they were and focusing it on housing-led planning and development. And I think then you do get back to the revamping of Homes England in some way, shape or form. Gove in January announced, when he was then Levelling Up Secretary, he announced this pilot with Sheffield and Wolverhampton. There is this £1.5 billion brownfield fund, which is designed to get over the fact that something you and I were talking about, Andrew, earlier this week, that actually in the north, before you get to the planning problem, it's about the fact that the market, without the public pound funding remediation of land, building land parcels, building land banks, the market can't sustain the development. And therefore, I think when you look around the world, and I think, Gove does quite a lot of this, it's pretty clear that strategic, targeted public investment to get these things moving does work. And I know you guys have done work on King's Cross, and I'm neither a planning nor development zone expert. I'm a newspaper reporter, so I only sort of pass on what I hear. And I think, against that, and this is why I think you won't get clarity. You won't necessarily get clarity on Thursday, but against that is, the Treasury wants to claw back money. The 1.5 billion is sort of unspent, and I don't think Wolverhampton and Sheffield, maybe someone on this call can correct me, but I don't think Wolverhampton and Sheffield have seen much or any of the money that they were promised. There was a small kind of Kickstarter grant that they were promised, but I think one constraining factor here will be, how far to the right the Treasury seeks to push some of that brownfield or repurpose some of that brownfield fund, and how much Gove can cling on to and put to use. But I think that's the broad space that a Gove-led, however it's externally packaged. We did hear at one point that there was a sort of face-saving plan to keep investment zones, at least in name, so that, you know, the constituents of the Tory party that were excited about them and are excited about free ports and don't read the great Paul Swinney or Andrew Carter, you know, can still be left in a kind of comforting view that we're still doing some whizzy zone investment, free port trade, you know, word cloud thing, and then they can quietly get on with doing some substantive development. So that, I think, without being too flippant, is where it will end up. How it will play out, I really do think remains to be seen. You know, the levelling up funds and the levelling up pots and grants, you know, have been benighted by administration issues, by application issues. You know, DLUG has got a huge overspend, it's growing, and you know, when you talk to people on the ground in local councils, there's incredible frustration, understandably, at, you know, the speed at which these funds are distributed and administered. And I suspect that's another thing that Gove is going to have a go at trying to fix. But I think that will also constrain how much of this ambition, you know, as I've broadly framed it, is achieved.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So then we've got loads of questions coming in, Zoe, you know, on different aspects of it. In some respects, one of them is, well, several of them are asking a sort of related question, which is, you know, given the nature of investment zones, which are area-based initiatives where you are very deliberately creating conditions in a place which is different from the conditions outside of that place, even if you do several across the country, that principle still applies. And we also know that, you know, area-based initiatives is a particular like of this sort of policy area that we work in. You know, we do like area-based initiatives, or at least the policy world, policymakers like area-based initiatives. Kind of, does that raise bigger questions about, you know, that model of boundaries, conditions within being different without, and all the problems that come from substitution, displacement, dead weight, etc., etc. You know, there's several questions on that. I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts on that. Maybe Paul, you can come in on that, and then we'll come back to this issue about, therefore, where do we go next on the idea of investment zones itself. Zoe, what's your thought on that? I suppose that bigger question about the very nature of a lot of the place-based stuff we do in economic development or regeneration.
Yeah, look, I think we probably all agree that in order to help reduce regional inequality, we need place-based policies, and there's always going to be trade-offs inherent within that. It's just that we know with investment zones and enterprise zones alike that there are very high opportunity costs of doing such tax breaks and deregulation, kind of, you know, stealing businesses from one area just to put them in another, whilst introducing a government subsidy, which kind of makes no economic sense. So I think, you know, when I think about Liverpool, for instance, where I'm speaking to you from and where I live, you know, enterprise zones were part of the kind of early mix in the 60s. And I think this is, you know, eternal problem of regional policy, is that it changes so frequently that disentangling the effect of one thing and the other can leave it ambiguous as to what's really done the heavy lifting and what hasn't worked. Certainly the kind of enterprise zones and mishmash of urban policy in Liverpool in the 60s and 70s didn't work. And it wasn't until there was a Merseyside Development Corporation, it wasn't until, you know, actual proper partnership between public and private sector, and it wasn't until the EU funding that started in '94 on the basis of it being at the kind of Objective 1 region, it wasn't until those things fell into place that we started seeing significant change. So place-based policy, yes, there's always going to be some sorts of trade-offs, but very heavy in this example, and there's much better ways to do it.
Very good. Okay, I'll come to you in a second, Paul. Councillor Hughes from Sandwell. Yes, when we are talking about references to the north, we're also in some respects, not in every respect, referencing issues in places such as yours as well, where you're right in terms of low land values. Severe contamination means that market-led stuff is very, very difficult unless you do the preparatory work, and we have to think very carefully about how we do that, because the market, however you define it, won't do that if it's not supported to do it. But Paul, come back to this, you know, the bigger, broader question about IZ's place-based activity. You know, what's your reflection on that?
As Peter said, we've just done a report very recently looking at regeneration and looking at it through the lens of the idea of these regeneration zones that were in the the Levelling Up white paper in February, which seemed to then sort of broadly morph into investment zones. The key difference between, in principle, those two policies, the regen zone and the investment zone, is that the regen zone is about using public sector capital investment to overcome those exact market failures that the council just set out there around land remediation, around trying to deal with fragmentation of land ownership, around dealing with urban blight, around dealing with things like first mover problems when you've got this new development, and who's going to take the first punt to move in there if no one else has moved in there as yet, particularly in an area that might have been struggling beforehand. All these things require public sector investment, and they're not cheap either. And the investment zone approach seemed to be about, well, don't worry about that, we're just going to do regulation, because that's actually, or deregulation, I say, because actually that's quite a cheap thing for the public purse to do. But again, it doesn't tackle those issues as to why private sector investment is not going into those places in the first place. And I think there needs to be a mindset shift, which hopefully there is. Hopefully we'll see a bit of this on the 17th, notwithstanding the constraints that we find ourselves in from a public finances perspective, which will be acknowledging that in order to get growth going outside of the Greater South East, so that includes the Midlands and North and Wales and Scotland and the South West as well, and Northern Ireland. I won't have covered everybody there, so nobody thinks I've excluded them. In order to get growth outside of the Greater South East, you're going to require that public sector investment in order to get that longer term return. Now, of course, we could say finances are going bad, we're in unprecedented times because of cost of living increases, because of the war in Ukraine, because of the fallout from COVID. But of course, we could have made that argument in 2010, with the fallout from the global financial crisis. And I'm sure we could have made that argument back in the early 1990s, or indeed at any point, probably through the 1970s and maybe through the first half of the 1980s as well. There's always these large crises as reasons as to why you wouldn't do this thing, which then means that 20, 30 or 40 years later, we then find ourselves here today having exactly this discussion about how to try and get money into certain places. Now, the German example of this is very interesting. So in order to bring East and West together, estimates suggest that since around about 1990, they've invested about 2 trillion euros in trying to bring, in terms of trying to pull the East up. Now, the money is the big headline there, and the money is absent from this debate at the moment. And interestingly, Rishi Sunak was Chancellor in February when the white paper was published without any real new money attached to it. So that's a little bit of a concern. That was before public finances went even further south. But the second interesting element in learning from the German example is that there was a consistency of policy. And again, this echoes, I think, what we've said already today, is that in the UK, we've got a long history of constantly changing institutions, constantly changing policies as governments change, or indeed in the last couple of years as leaders change. And this year is just, it's been ridiculous in terms of the policies churn that we've had. And you think about the challenge that local authorities now must face about, they were told to put in expressions of interest for investment zones, and then the policy seemed to be dead 3 weeks later. Which must be incredibly frustrating for colleagues doing that. So it's that lesson from Germany about that consistency of what they were trying to achieve, very clear strategy. And there was a mix of policies underneath that, but it was consistency in terms of what they want to achieve, which we need to try and learn from in the UK context rather than having all this churn. Okay,
that's a very good point about the size and scale of it. Peter, I'm going to come back to you in this. There's a comment from an anonymous attendee, it says, but nevertheless, this is a defence of IZs, and picks up on your point about uncertainty. And the defence, I'm not saying it's all of it, is the IZs offered the chance to accelerate, capture live investment inquiries and provide some long-term certainty. This is important in the current economic political funding chaos, especially in areas with deep-rooted market failures. So, Peter, you talked about uncertainty, you talked about the bigger investment problem. You alluded to the questions about aggregate demand because of Brexit, etc., which I know you also think deeply about. Investment zones offer a sort of a micro way of trying to overcome some of that deep uncertainty. What, convinced or not? What's your response, Peter?
I just think the problem with it is it's a chaotic response to chaos in some ways, right? An investment zone. And actually, there is a narrative out there. There's a real, I used to be based in India, in China, in Washington, and covered Europe for 5 years before I did this UK policy job. And when the this country has massive things going for it, in life sciences, in future industries, and the number of unicorns in its services sector, etc. Which is not, even though we, seem to be behaving like a basket case country, we are not, except that, there is a narrative getting up there among other European countries, in the States, etc. Where people are really shaking their heads at this country, and I think these narratives, whether they're right or wrong, they can kind of run ahead of themselves. And what we need to do is, and this is what I think Sunak's trying to do in this, by really going hard with the budget statement on November the 17th, is to try and re-establish credibility. And I'm just not sure that when you talk to big companies looking at making investments, that investment zones would bring those kind of long-term high GVA type investments forward. They might bring some micro investments forward, but in some ways I think that's a distraction if that's getting away from the fact that we do need coherent long-term policy making that is in some level immune from political cycles, which get shorter and shorter and shorter, and which, as we've seen over the last 6 years, as we've tried to reconcile this sort of cognitive dissonance over what we thought Brexit was going to deliver and what's actually happened, we've also corroded a lot of other kind of good English, British institutions in terms of the rule of law, in terms of regulatory certainty, in terms of the outlook. We have, for example, we're starting a new subsidy control regime. We're promising to have this. I mean, I think it won't happen, but have this sunset clause that sees a lot of EU regulation drop off the statute book. If you're looking in from the outside and considering where to invest in a country that's just walled itself off from the market of 450 million people on its doorstep, if you think investment zones are going to make all the difference, oh well, hang all that, we'll go for an investment zone. I just don't buy that. In fact, it advertises the kind of headless chicken nature of policy making in this country over the last few years. And Paul draws the parallel with Germany, which is not without its own problems, and the investment to get the East to catch up. You go to the old East Germany, it's still quite a long way behind the West, but it has very strong local government. The lender system is very strong in Germany, which is why, in lots of ways, they recovered from the kind of post-industrial and entered into a new modern industrial era where we let our industry rot in the 70s, 80s and 90s. And they have a different political system, proportional representation. They spend weeks and weeks putting their governments together. They move slowly, but they tend to cleave to the centre ground in a way that our first past the post politics in recent years has really struggled to do with all of the results that we've talked about. And so, in some ways, let's hope that the Sunak government is the beginning of a reset and, a beginning of more strategic, long-term policy making. Yeah,
okay. That's very good. Zoe, come to you. And a couple of kind of observations, but also a question then from Tony Smith and he's reflecting on the Birmingham experience. He makes this point, he makes several points, but effective zones, however you define them, need to generate public investment as well as attracting private investment. They need to work together. The Birmingham city centre EZ did actually have some benefits because of the way that it was constructed, and it was based around tax increment financing, which is kind of interesting model then about how you do that. But then he also says infrastructure investment, however defined, needs to be coincide with social investment as well. So we need to think about, the kind of broader growth agenda, not just a kind of physical property-based type program. I mean, I know you've thought about that and have talked extensively about that. So just say a little bit about, if these things are going to change and we're going to get new iterations or whatever it might be, how would you want to see them evolve and develop, picking up on some of what Tony's been saying?
Yeah, exactly as Tony says, and actually picking up on what Peter mentioned, what I would really hope to see next Thursday, is it already on budget day, is that the government restates its understanding that actually public sector investment crowds in private sector investment. And that, I think, is still an open question. And from conversations in and around Whitehall. I'm not sure that's the current orthodoxy, let's say, in DLUC. So I'm kind of hoping that we see a restatement of a commitment that those two things do really go hand in hand. And as you say, there are multiple types of infrastructure that we can talk about here, but in terms of a positive vision and what actually businesses want, of course, on the physical infrastructure front, we've talked about kind of city centre development. I won't mention the word Northern Powerhouse Rail in case my heart starts racing too fast, but obviously we know transport across the north is critical for the development of each and every city and town across the north, not just one or another. But as you say, that's got to go hand in hand with investment in the people in those places across the north. I know in Sandwell, for instance, one of the local authorities in the West Midlands, of course, 1 in 5 people don't have a GCSE. Like, that's the skill level we're talking about in terms of what's lacking in some of our local authorities and regions across the country. So I think transport and skills would probably be my ask for business, to get business investment into the country. That would be the 2 areas that I would propose to the government investing in order to shift the dial in which places become investable propositions, or however we're meant to call them.
And you referred earlier on to some of the planning elements of the IZ idea, but also some of the planning reforms that are more broadly talked about. You alluded to the fact you had some views and maybe different views. Just expand on that a little bit. What would you be thinking in terms of the planning system, which is often talked about in certain contexts to be quite a big problem, and in other contexts it's probably not quite a big problem, or at least it's a challenge in a slightly different way. But your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's important people say clearly what they mean by planning reform. I actually think ours is more of a land market reform that I would really want to see to get development moving in this country. I think land has, for decades in this country, been subject to financial speculation, land hoarding, until land values go up, which then of course increases the price of the properties that then go on them later. So actually I would say, for me, the planning question is one of land and reducing the ability of the sort of chance that if you're a landowner and you happen to be drawn into one of these zones, or that your hope value goes sky high, and then you capitalize on the huge benefit between what that land was valued at before it had planning permission on it, and just the luck of having the piece of land that happened to get planning permission or zoned in certain development zones, and then you take that whole increase. I think we need fundamentally to look at who's benefiting from that. And if it's just the landowners, something's going very wrong. And that's the money that is available to be shared. And that would therefore help us then build that infrastructure around developments. And I think that would be the most, shift the dial in the most positive way when we're talking about planning reform. And maybe I'm moving it a little bit into land reform, but for me, they're 2 sides of the same coin, and you can't tinker with making planning processes a little bit shorter or a little bit longer, or whatever the government might think planning reform means, without fundamentally changing the cost and the nature of development in the first place.
And your optimism that in the political sphere, on all sides of the politics, however you define this, I'm not just talking about government as is, but those that would wish to be in government, optimistic that they're going to address this issue? Well,
you may say no.
I was just happened to be shaking my head in a certain direction.
Oh, is that right? Is that right? Because if we look at how wealth is unequally held and distributed across the country, it's to do with housing and it's to do with pensions. I mean, maybe it's a bit of a side issue to this, but the opposition are looking at other ways to align taxation on income and wealth. So I think there is a shift in that direction, to looking at how wealth is distributed. And obviously, if you're a landowner that happens to have the right piece of land, you become wealthy very quickly, or add to your wealth very quickly.
Yeah.
I think on the other side of the political spectrum, I don't think it's out of the park that the Conservatives should want to pick this up, because ultimately, as I say, that I know there are certain parts of the Conservative Party who would also agree that actually just like there are certain parts of the Conservative Party who want to get rid of inheritance, who want to do like 100% inheritance tax. You know, that same wing are probably the ones that go, actually, yeah, it is unfair and a market failure that land should go up so much in value and then stifle development a bit randomly or a bit by chance. So I don't think it's out of the park for certain sections of the government. And I think general shifts towards the equalisation of taxation of income and wealth on Labour and the progressive side might show a signal in the right direction.
Yeah, no, quite. And if those that haven't, I'm sure many have, the pamphlet or the report that Tim Pitt wrote earlier on this week, was published earlier on this week for Onward, on how the Conservatives should think about economic policy, is quite interesting and picks up several of these issues around how a Conservative thought around wealth and inequality is actually fundamental to the kind of principles. So if you haven't looked at that, I encourage you to do that. I want to move us slightly in to pick up on, again, an issue that both Paul and Peter touched on in some comments about Germany, and it's come through in several questions. Kevin Johnson, always reliable, says, doesn't this latest episode of centralised competitive bid seeking exercise discourage local authorities from playing ball and committing so much resource in short order to a flawed process? In part, a slightly more leading question, isn't just the example where IZs get announced by one administration, local authorities have 2 to 3 weeks to submit quite onerous requirements, which they largely do, and then the administration folds, and now we're talking about scrapping the IZs, and there's no kind of recollection or recognition that there's been a wasted effort. Isn't that, I think, a perfect example of all that's bad between central and local relations? Paul, you pile in. It's a leading question, but I've teed it up. You finish it off, and I get Peter to come in as well, because it's just doesn't seem to me to be a sensible way to run the country, right?
Yeah, I mean, Peter was talking quite rightly about certainty and giving business certainty. I think there's an element of certainty in the political process for actually other parts of policymakers to be able to understand what's going on as well. And I understand why local authorities would rush in to try and put in the expressions of interest with that impossibly short deadline, because it is the only thing that's on the table for them, which is representative of the fact, or illustrative of the fact of the way that we've got our political system set up in the UK, which is a lot of the power is held in the centre, which was Kevin was alluding to in his question. And then sort of the centre is able to sort of throw those bits off the table that local authorities have to dive in and jump on. And Marvin Rees at one of our party conference events, he said he associated with the game Scramble, which some kids used to play in the playground, where it's like one kid has a sweet and throws it up in the air and shouts Scramble, and all the other kids have to dive after it. Who's going to be the lucky winner? That's the way that government has run these sorts of things in recent years, not just around IZs, but around Levelling Up Fund, High Street Fund, and all this sort of thing, this centralisation of power. And we shouldn't really be in that position. And that's where the white paper, the Levelling Up white paper back in February, was very encouraging, is that it was very forthright about devolution and trying to push devolution on. And I think if we were to get, a great amount of devolution from that, especially now Michael Gove's back, but nothing else happened, I think that would be a real win, trying to shift away from this position. But yes, I mean, surely you can only empathise with local authority colleagues who had to go through that process, and you would have thought that next time you'd think, once bitten, twice shy, and probably wouldn't want to put all of the time into it. But on the flip side, because of the structure that they operate in, if they don't go for that, what else are they going to go for? What else are they going to have? And so maybe it's the case that the game is set up that they do have to just go for it and waste all this time and all this money for things that ultimately are not going to be that effective, even if they do come through. In the case of the IZs, actually not going to come through. Yeah,
very good. Peter, your reflections on this? I mean, it's just a sort of broken system between central and local, right, in the way that things get decided, or either for good or for ill, and get stopped and started, and then everybody's scrambling around.
Yeah, it is. I mean, nobody should think that the fact that local authorities piled into investment zones meant that local authorities thought they were a brilliant idea. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Poland, as Paul rightly says, that it's the only game in town, and if that's a way to accelerate a project or get some money out of the central system, then you've got to play the game. But myself and my brilliant colleague Jen Williams spent a lot of time talking to local authorities when the scramble was on, and people were fully aware of the limitations, etc. But there was huge political pressure to play the game, I just you can I mean, maybe Gove will, you know, push forward the mayoral development corporations as a way to, you know, try and get some more top level planning into the process. But there will be a pressure quite soon to, you know, deliver the kind of hanging baskets and high street stuff that is often non-strategic, sucks up bandwidth in Whitehall, and is exactly the kind of thing that, you know, MPs want something to point to. You know, the Tories are way behind in the polls, but actually, you know, those more, I mean, this is not a Brexit point actually, but, you know, Brexit, the EU structural funds were structural, right? They were regional, they were cross-body, and they did things that you couldn't always point at, but actually delivered long-term structural benefits. And a lot of these new funds and projects, you know, you've got to spend them by the end of the year. You've got to just slap some paint up on a wall somewhere so that people can point at stuff. And I think, you know, that is itself really corrosive when it comes to, you know, long-term development of new industries. I mean, the skills piece, the skills improvement plans, getting colleges a statutory obligation to hook in their course provision offer with what industry needs locally was a good thing, is a good thing. You know, there are good things happening out there. The government is committed, and you know, Gillian Keegan, I think, is committed to a new skills agenda. But you know, we've been round and round these houses. This goes back to consistent policy making. It'll be, you know, political cycle. I mean, there've been mini cycles within it, but you know, we're not that far from getting back into another election cycle. Another 5 years will have gone by.
Yeah.
And you know, one of the saddest things I think about the last few years is that actually the country tore itself to pieces over the wretched Brexit referendum and how it was implemented. Boris Johnson did put that to bed at one level. He won an 80-seat majority. He then created something in Levelling Up, which actually did give a kind of a coat peg on which people to hang this idea that actually the North-South divide or spatial economic inequalities needed to be addressed in order, you know, for the wider economic and political health of the country. And if we get to another 5 years where the wheel has turned again, and people once again point to the fact that, well, they never do anything, these politicians, it's incredibly corrosive for the politics of the country. Because actually, I think whatever your views about Brexit or Boris Johnson, etc., there was a real opportunity there to actually do something concrete and constructive. And I just fear that we've squandered it. And I find that, you know, that genuinely worrying, because it creates another cycle where it gets harder and harder to be strategic.
Yeah, no, quite. Zoe, come in. Your reflections on the kind of central and local, but then in the last sort of 10 minutes, I just want to get your thoughts around. So do that, but I want to get some thoughts around the fact Gove is back, right? And I think on that, you know, all things being equal, that's a good thing for the levelling up agenda. And so we get your thoughts on what we would like to see him be doing. What are the things, what advice would we be giving him? What are we giving him now in order to make progress, notwithstanding the things that Peter just said? But Zoe, just give us your thoughts on this central local challenge in terms of, I mean, is it naive to hope that at one point local authorities collectively come together and say, the next time you do this kind of thing, we're not going to play the game?
I wish they would collaborate in that way, but I don't think that's
no, it's a naive view, which is fair enough. Yeah.
But on the other hand, though, the only example, or a recent example, that actually, when I was speaking with a group of cities at conference season this year, is on the climate change front. Actually, you know, cities are collaborating to join up and jointly seek investment, private investment, to say retrofit housing in their places and other sort of green schemes to meet net zero targets. And they are joining forces to collectively go to investors and say, we're a joint proposition, not just one and the other. So it can be done non-competitively, and maybe climate change will be one of those galvanizing issues that allows us to take that example. I just want to say one other thing, reflecting on what Peter and Paul were just saying, is that I think underlying all of this, there's the question of the question that Gove tackled when he was in sort of last time, so to speak, was, do we put our pound in the place that gives us the best return immediately, or are we patient and we put it in the places that won't give us immediate return, but will do in the medium to long run? And that's what I really hope he sticks to. Obviously, there was like the Treasury Green Book reform. We're not quite sure yet whether that's having a kind of material impact on what decisions are being made out of Treasury. But I think that question is really important, because actually, of course, the places that had a bunch of works that they already had lists and plans to do, who then you get your investment zone prospectus or you get your levelling up fund prospectus, and you have shovel ready projects ready to go, and they're not necessarily the ones that need it most. So then you kind of completely lose the thread on the idea that we should be investing in places that don't give you immediate return but do in the medium to long run. So not only was it not sensible or grown up politics and relations between central and local, it also, the whole method undermines the very principle of having to start on a lower return and accepting that as a short-term investment for long-term gain.
Yeah, well, that is a very good point. Peter, Gove, he's back. I think that's a good thing. I mean, others might disagree, but I think it's better to have him as Secretary of State for Levelling Up than not. What is it that we think he should be doing in the next short-term period in order to signal that, you know, levelling up is important, but also materially, so we can make some progress, notwithstanding we won't make as progress as if we'd started 3 years ago?
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with you. Gove's return is a good thing. He's a very substantive and serious politician. I don't always agree with him, you know, but he has to work within the political framework, you know, which he has, you know, played to over the years to get to where he's got to. But, you know, net, I think he is a good return. So he puts a finger on a really important point, one of which is political, which is the Treasury doesn't really buy into levelling up, because it just sees it, you know, the danger is you're just chucking money at non-productive places. So if you're going to make the argument that you're going to, you know, seed places that will become more productive over time, which I think is, you know, where Gove is. You know, Gove, remember, wanted to, as someone memorably told me, flush the Oxford-Cambridge arc down the toilet. But you need to, if you're going to invest, I mean, this is, you know, I don't want to talk the Centre for Cities book, right? But this is the Centre for Cities. And actually, if you're going to make these investments in places that are not going to give you as much of a return as investing in already productive places, which is really a prospectus for investing in the Southeast, you come back to the fact that you do need a really coherent and strategic plan for doing that, that you are going to create productive economic clusters based around city centres effectively, that are going to deliver over the longer and medium term. And we've seen how difficult that is, partly because of local resistance to planning, etc., and partly because political cycles are getting shorter and shorter. And, you know, people do want stuff to point at. Now, the two things shouldn't be mutually exclusive, but, you know, Gove doesn't have a magic wand. Gove has to deal with the current fiscal situation. He's, you know, we saw with the white paper, ultimately he didn't get any more money for the white paper. And so I don't think, you know, sadly, that goes, you know, return to the fold is suddenly going to bring us into a new sunny uplands of cogent policy making and put us on a kind of stable path for the future. You know, in some ways we've squandered too much of this political cycle for there be time to him to make that much difference. But he will make a difference. He will. It is a good thing, even if that's a slightly depressing prognosis.
So is your sense, Peter, that, you know, given the nature of the challenges, and obviously, as you said, you know, the fiscal or funding challenges that we've got at the minute, that inevitably it's things like, or agendas like levelling up, that always get paused or significantly reduced when the public pound gets squeezed? You know, it's always a kind of classic, right? We hold on to NHS and we hold on to welfare through pensions, and then essentially everything else just maybe we hold on some defence. everything else just gets squeezed, and levelling up is just inevitably, but always going to be in the bucket of, we can do it when times are good, but when times are bad, it just goes the way of other things. Is that your sort of slightly depressing sort of analysis?
I mean, clearly the danger here is that we had a self-inflicted supply side shock caused by Brexit, and we're now going to lurch into a self-inflicted demand side shock because of, being forced to overcorrect for the kamikaze budget. And the Treasury, you talk to people in Whitehall, I'm sure you hear what I hear, which is the Treasury is hammering away at capital expenditure, which is probably, the best bang for the public buck. I suspect that they will try and, we'll have to see. It'll be very interesting to see what happens to R&D budgets, to the 2.4, the OECD average commitment.
2.6, 2.7. Yeah.
It'd be very interesting to see what happens to that. Remember that R&D target got pushed to the right in the last budget, and so I'm talking to businesses. I can tell you, who are really worried about that, and who are telling me that when we talk about investability, that if the government rows back on those kind of R&D commitments to future technologies, etc., then these companies will take their next materials research to the Netherlands, to Germany, right? It's a competitive space.
Yeah.
And actually, we put ourselves in lots of ways in a non-competitive position by getting ourselves out of Horizon Europe 2020, by putting ourselves out the single market. We're not the obvious choice we always were, and yet we politically we seem to be behaving where we just fundamentally don't appreciate where the pickle we've got ourselves into, right? This is the and it's all fixable in lots of ways, maybe not in the macro way, but there needs to be a serious recognition of where we're at and what we need to do to fix it.
Yeah, agree. Paul, just your final reflections. We're nearly out of time on the Gove question. What do we need from him now that he's back and his feet are under the table?
To implement the white paper that he oversaw and published in February would be the very short answer. What do we need to see within the next 2 years, which is the maximum amount of time that we've got until the next election? I think one is to push through on devolution. We do know that there are a number of deals that are waiting to be signed off by ministers. And then we've got the Trailblazer deals, so West Midlands and Greater Manchester as well. They can be sorted and done in fairly short order. And then the second thing would be to bring forward this idea of the regeneration zone. So whether that's a repackaging of the investment zone, or whether it is what was originally intended specifically in terms of what was in the white paper, bringing something forward which was much more close to that white paper version than the investment zone version, what could be done, and the ball could certainly start rolling within the next 2 years on that as well.
Yeah, very good. Well, I think we are a minute or two from 1 o'clock, so we need to come to a close. I mean, I think we were the poll at the start, and then contributions and questions and comments throughout. I think we're pretty clear that the investment zones, if they continue, at least won't make material or substantive difference. So we're already advocating for a revision and a change. The degree to which we get revision and change, and to what extent, maybe we'll get a little bit of insight on that from the 17th. We wait and see. I think the other two things I would say is, from comments again from colleagues, is that we need a much broader understanding really of what drives growth and prosperity in the places that we've been talking about. And it's an agenda, however you define it, that extends well beyond tax and regulation. That is for sure. We can we can debate the boundaries of what that agenda might look like, but it definitely extends far beyond a tax and regulatory kind of scope or focus. And then the final point, which everybody has said in slightly different ways, is that public investment is going to be needed. And in a sense, public investment will actually, if done well, will actually release and attract further rounds of private investment. I think that's the thing, and we do need the private investment. So we have to think carefully about how we use the public pound to unlock the private pound or private pound. So I think that's important as well. So as always, thank you to everybody that came on the call. Thank you all for submitting your questions and your comments. We got through quite a few. Hope that was useful and for voting as always. And a huge thank you to my panel, Paul, colleague, but also Zoe and Peter. Thanks for coming and spending a bit of time and sharing your thoughts with us. We all look with eagerness towards the 17th for some answers. Who knows? But until the next time, take care and stay safe. Bye-bye. Thanks for now.
Bye-bye.
Okay, it's 12 o'clock. I know people